All right, it's noon, so we're going to begin. Hello and welcome to Welty at Home, the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And today we're so excited to begin our new series on Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We are delighted that Susan Allen Ford, Professor Emerita of Delta State University and editor of Persuasions, the Jane Austen Journal, will be co-leading these discussions alongside Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, Suzanne Marrs, Professor Emerita of Millsaps College and the fearless leader of Welty at Home. Thank you, Suzanne, for returning. Before we go further, let's cover some housekeeping. To comment or ask a question, click the Reactions tab on your screen. Going to let some more people in. So the Reactions tab is at the bottom of your screen, and you can click the raise hand function. If you're on a tablet or an iPhone, you may have to tap your screen in order to see that. Everyone is on mute, so when it's your turn to talk, be sure to unmute yourself. I can't unmute you, but I can ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can go back on mute when your turn is over. And we're looking forward to your comments and your questions. There's also a lively discussion that often takes place in the chat as well, so be sure to glance over at the chat box every now and then. And one of the things I'm going to do is share a link right now in the chat with everyone.
Let me try those.
And before we discuss Volume 1, Chapters 1 through 8 of Pride and Prejudice, Susan Ford is going to lead a discussion on an essay by Eudora Welty called The Radiance of Jane Austen. It's published in the book, The Eye of the Story, Selected Essays and Reviews, which is available in bookstores and online, but we have included a link to this essay. That's what I just put in the chat, and it was in our Welty at Home newsletter that went out on September 9th, and it's available to you at no cost until September 16th. And before we dive into that, though, we have a very special guest today who has graciously agreed to share a personal story about Jane Austen and her aunt, Eudora Welty. So next we'll hear from Mary Alice Welty White, the niece of Eudora Welty and a fellow Austenite who currently serves on the Eudora Welty Foundation. Mary Alice, welcome.
Hi, thank you. It is anyway, I'll give you the background. In 1965, I was a senior at Murrah High School, and my English teacher, we all had to write our senior paper, and we were to compare a Mississippi author to a British author. And she pulled me aside as I was leaving class and said, Mary Alice, you just have to do Eudora Welty, your aunt. You're the only one who can go to the actual source. And I kept saying, no, because, I didn't want to impose on Eudora. No. Anyway, she kept insisting. So I did ask Eudora if she would make a few comments. And one day when I got home, there was this envelope in my door, and it says, putting an Algonquin envelope, Mary Alice, a few notes if they're of any use to you. Sorry to miss you, Dodo. And inside were these two typed pages, and I will read them to you. And I will say before I read them that once she wrote it, this was the conclusion to my paper. Verbatim, I used it, putting the teacher on the spot just like she had put me. Likenesses. Both novels are set in self-contained small worlds. Both limit themselves in scope to the domestic scene. In both, the family is the story, with its relationships and situations, and the matrimonial plot. Both are feminine in style and approach, and in their narrative point of view. Neither, I hope, is sentimental. Instead, both are, I hope, observant and written with an eye and ear as sharp as possible. In Miss Austen's case, neither eye nor ear is often been surpassed. Both are comic novels. Differences. They are 2.5 centuries and the Atlantic Ocean between the two writers to begin with. Yet we have learned for ourselves that Jane Austen's work cannot date for any reason of change in times or taste or fashions. The comedy and the irony and the wit, the character drawing, the delightful invention of plot and incident, the sparkling vitality, the sure and minute knowledge of her society, and her conveyance of it so as to make a whole world shine brightly in a few acres of English landscape. Through all this, Jane Austen will never stop being read and loved as a novelist. She is one of the very great English novelists of all time, and so more that in the case of The Centuries Apart and The Countries Apart, there is the question of her genius, which separates her from any American lady novelist now alive, I think, and most people surely think. One other similarity, both authors are aunts. So there it is.
Marvelous.
That is wonderful. What did she think of your paper? Did you show it to her?
No, I did not. I did tell her. I made an A because I knew that the teacher didn't have any choice. She knew I was going to. Eudora would ask. I don't think I don't remember showing it to her. I may have. I don't know. I can't remember.
Well, that is a wonderful story, and I will just add that in I think it was 2013, Carolyn Brown did a talk at the Welty House that was co-sponsored with the Jane Austen Society of North America's Mississippi region, and so she was talking about Welty's interest in Austen and Delta Wedding, and then at the end of the talk in the Q&A, Mary Alice stood up and waved this envelope and the pages within it, and it was this kind of magical moment, and where this new thing that nobody knew about was being shown to us.
I failed to say I compared Delta Wedding and Pride and Prejudice. Those were the two books, so I should have said that.
Well, it's an amazing story and document, and it seems to me pretty interesting that you can see a lot of the things that she's talking about in the radiance of Jane Austen, there as seeds in what she wrote for you. You might have kind of generated the whole essay for us. Does anybody have any questions for Mary Alice before we move to talking about the radiance of?
Mary Alice, I think you may have inspired Eudora to do the lecture she gave at Millsaps 3 years later. What your paper was 65? Is
65.
that right? Yeah. So 3 years later, she gives a lecture and then publishes a shorter form of that lecture in Shenandoah, and then it's published in book form in Atlantic Brief Lives after that. So I think maybe you were the prompt to the essay. Maybe.
Who knows?
And at the conception. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I will add, Marcia Huff, I see, has just put this in the chat, that Carolyn Brown's essay with images of the pages that Mary Alice just showed us are in Persuasions number 35, which was published in 2013. And Jessica is going to add that link to the chat, I think, but also we'll send it out tomorrow so that you can, make a copy of that essay if you're interested. Well,
It should be in the chat now.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
So Suzanne, did you want to say a little bit about the radiance in terms of the publication background for it?
Oh, I think I just did that, but I'll repeat it. That is that the essay was originally a lecture that Eudora gave at Millsaps in 1968, and then it was published in Shenandoah. And if I'm not mistaken, James Boatwright was at the time the editor of Shenandoah, a friend of Eudora's. And then Louis Cronenberger used it in Atlantic Brief Lives after that. So it had periodical publication and then book publication. But the essay I think that we have here is somewhat longer than those two published versions. Pearl may have more information about that than I do, you know? Okay. So that's how, I think that is a fairly accurate anyway, hopefully absolutely accurate.
Well, thank you. I guess what we wanted to start with was just see what you thought about Eudora's attitude toward or vision of Jane Austen that comes across in this essay. What strikes you about her reading of Jane Austen, what she sees or values in her work? Marcia? Unmute.
Right. Okay, I'm not going to answer that question, but what I'm going to say is that someone will. Of course, when a writer writes about a writer, you get a view of the author of the essay. And I was really struck with this part of the essay as it relates to Eudora Welty's own writing. She says, nothing can change his own life for the writer. To each of us alive, our own world is with us, as was Jane Austen's world entirely with her. To any novelist, that which is less important than one's own world's presence, its ruthless presence, its blotting out nearness and newness, is simply irrelevant. So I really appreciated the way in which she focused our attention on Jane Austen creating, working within her own life. She says Jane Austen's frame was that of belonging to her world. And that is describes so much Eudora Welty's writing. I just wanted to make that comment.
Let me add too that, you know, Eudora says the reader is the only traveler.
Yeah, I love that.
Here is a work made by the imagination for the imagination. So it's asking the reader to imagine himself or herself into this world in which Jane Austen lived. And I think it's part of the magic of the book is doing that.
Mm-hmm. And I think Marcia is right. It really gets at what my experience of reading Welty has been in the last couple of years, that sense of entering that world that she is in and that she's creating for us, rather than trying to, you know, push it into my own world.
Who was next? I think it might have been Jacob and then Sarah. Is that right?
Yes.
Jacob?
I'll add real quick one comment. I was not here when you guys read Losing Battles, but I heard Welty wrestling with losing battles in this essay. Her focus on things like a group of people having conversations, the noise of Jane Austen. I loved that as a compliment to Austen's fiction. So, as you know, this is a kind of cliche of criticism, but however much we're trying to say something true about a writer, oftentimes we're projecting things about ourselves. I can hear Welty almost trying to imitate what she sees in Austen in Losing Battles. That's all I wanted to say.
Sarah?
What wonderful comments. What struck me reading this essay for the first time in a long time was how much Welty values Jane Austen's comedy. She remarks several times on how funny Jane Austen is in the comedy, but also what the comedic aspects allow Austen to do, that Austen can comment on her world kind of slyly in that narrator voice because of the comedy. And that's what I find Welty also capable of doing. So like Marcia and Jacob, I do think Welty is kind of reading herself as at the same time she's reading Austen.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, you get the sense that she sees this comedy as a kind of framework within which, just like the houses, within which Austen can do as much as she does, and that she's doing the same kind of thing.
Oh, Harriet and then Monica and Pearl, I think.
Yeah, I want to go on with that. And, you know, the ideas that that Marcia started, you know, that Welty is choosing choosing to celebrate a chosen mentor and is talking about things that are parallel in her work, this genius of originality and genius of comedy, and her sense of critics that misunderstand Austen as a spinster, a snob, and remote, and her celebration of Austen as a woman who writes the scene of the family scene, where everything happens, and it's a remarkable essay that way.
Monica?
Well, I want to just kind of echo Sarah and what some people in the chat are saying. First of all, I'm so excited to be here with y'all and talking about Pride and Prejudice because, I first read it in high school and didn't have any other friends who had read it. I've read it once in a class, in an undergraduate class as an undergraduate. And I was the only person in that class going, but she's so funny. The reason why we still read Pride and Prejudice is because that one letter of Mr. Darcy's makes me laugh out loud every single time I read it. And I love Welty's phrase that she hopes readers of the future will not lose or throw away their heritages of absurdity. And I just love that.
Pearl and Beverly.
I too, as I was reading the essay, could not get Delta Wedding and Losing Battles out of my mind. And it made me think, oh, I need to go back and read those again and listen to the noise. I don't think I've listened to the noise, although then I started thinking about all of the activity and noise that was going on. And I agree that it seems like she is writing about herself and against the critics that criticize her for her kind of writing, especially the critics that had written about Delta Wedding. But I also feel that she's answering the classics and saying, well, tragedy may have its tragedy, but comedy does not have to be sentimental, and comedy should not be the lesser form of dramatic arts. So I think that's a good lesson for us to take into account also.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I was thinking about how she emphasizes how much emotion there is in Austen and the depth of emotion, so that it's not just the kind of brittle surface, but there's something really deeper there. That's certainly true for her too.
Beverly?
I was struck when I was reading the chapters that we had so far on Pride and Prejudice. Like Eudora, she's very subtly, Jane Austen's very subtly attacking sort of the status quo, this idea, this snobbery with the Bingleys and the upper class, not Mr. Bingley, but the rest of them, of course, Darcy. And just like in Eudora's work, if you read carefully, and she has her Must the Novelist Crusade, you've got, if you read her carefully, she is, I wouldn't say she's crusading, but she's making a point about racism, the difference, the servants that are depicted in Delta Wedding. I mean, you don't even have to go into where's the voice coming from to come to that, but it's not the central part of the novel. Just like in Pride and Prejudice, we've got all this wonderful character development and all this humor, but we've also got these snooty mean girls that are probably a whole lot more of those snooty mean girls than there are of the Janes and the Elizabeth Bennets in the world. So I think the subtlety in both of them and how they handle their subject matter is brilliant.
Harriet, did you have something else?
Yeah, I was thinking about, first of all, I was thinking about the word remote while Beverly was talking. It's a wonderful word choice, it seems to me, to be talking about what I understand as an interest in the historical or the political, and so I agree with you, Beverly, about the parallel. I mean, she's talking about Austen being remote from the from French Revolution and history and Welty turns it so that her disagreement is clear. But I was also thinking about the extent to which the essay is about a writer's relationship with a reader, and her discussion of Austen reading to her family and confidence in having a reader who will follow and be the right reader for the work, which made me think about Eudora reading to Justina, losing battles bits, but it also made me think about the extent to which Welty has confidence in her reader, that we will get it, despite the moment when critics don't. Yeah.
Joe Ellen.
Hi, just one last thing. I want to note that when Welty is also musing about time and remoteness and what might last 100 years from now or so, that she wonders whether her minor characters, like, oh man, I just lost their names. Aunt from Emma.
Bates.
Oh,
Bates.
Thank you. Yeah, Miss Bates and Emma's father. But I really think when you think about Dickens, it's exactly those minor characters that seem to last for me. Remember how Virginia Woolf ends, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, never desert, will never leave Mrs. Brown. So they're just echoes, and I really think they might have the longest lives. Anyway, just a comment.
Susan, can I ask one question?
yeah.
Jane Austen has survived, and we have all these movie versions. But I think sometimes Beverly and I were talking about this earlier. Sometimes the movie versions, it seems to me, do exactly what Eudora asked us not to do. That is, they try to drag the books into the present. The most recent Persuasion seems to me does that. And I remember when I was watching the movie version of A Room with a View, which I loved, and I tried to get Eudora to watch it with me, and she would not. She said, no, I love the book too much to watch a movie version of it. So
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think in some ways you just have to kind of detach and say, well, this is an act of criticism, really, or an act of reading. And so I'm just going to, take it for what it is. But one thing that I find so fascinating about this is how she's actually picking up a lot of the threads of Jane Austen criticism, over the years. So, I mean, she talks about how besides writing perfectly, she did so not in the least by accident, which is, I think, a direct response to both her, Jane Austen's own nephew, who talks about things dropping kind of perfectly formed from her pen, and also Henry James, who, just, thinks of her writing as little bits of dropped stitches, that are so, perfect, but also kind of unconscious. But also, there are so many people at this time, and even into the 21st century, who are thinking of Austen's world as being a world of limits, that she doesn't know much, that she's, it's a limited, small, decorous world, unlike, the worlds that Melville or somebody else would provide for us. And Welty, I think, is kind of ahead of the curve here in looking at Austen and seeing that this is not a limited writer, a perfect and limited writer. There's an article that comes out on Austen's bicentenary in 1975 by Donald Green called The Myth of Limitation. And, he kind of makes the same case, but still people are making the same case in the 21st century. So, I mean, she's really onto something with Austen, and I think she really gets what's going on in these books. It just, I was blown away when I read this essay. I think it's just wonderful. Okay, well, if we want to move to talking about Pride and Prejudice, I did sort of take a page from Suzanne's book and just have a little bit of background for us. Austen, you probably know, was born in 1775 to a family who lived in Steventon, which is a small village in Hampshire. Her father was a Church of England rector, and she grew up in this family that gave her that kind of confidence in audience that Welty is talking about in the Radiance of Jane Austen. Austen wrote the first version of this novel, First Impressions, probably between October of 1796. So when she was still 20, through October or August of 1797. By that time, she'd turned 21. So this was a pretty amazing and young product. Her father sent a letter to Thomas Cadell, who was a pretty well-established and respected publisher, who actually had a big novel list, and offered it to him in August of 1797. And Cadell just wrote back and by the return post, and just refused it. So that novel then sat on the shelf for a good long time. She wrote other things. She wrote an early version of Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor and Marianne. She wrote an early version of Northanger Abbey, which was called Susan, which is actually the first thing she sold, though it was never published. And I think, I get the sense that the 1790s was a pretty productive period for her. But then her father retired. They moved to Bath. They were doing a lot of traveling and a lot of socializing, and she was kind of uprooted from her normal patterns of life. And then in January of 1805, Mr. Austen died, and that sent the women who into a kind of more peripatetic lifestyle. They traveled a bunch for a while. They lived with some relatives. They ended up moving to Southampton and sharing a house with one of her brothers, till about 1809, when she moved. The women moved to Chawton. They were provided with a house by another brother. Austen wasn't really doing any writing, but in 1809 they moved to Chawton. They get, which is another village like Steventon. They get established, and then she begins writing again. The first thing she does is to revise Sense and Sensibility some, and she sells that. And it's published by Thomas Egerton in October of 1811. And then she starts revising First Impressions into Pride and Prejudice in November or December 1811. That gets sold in the autumn of 1812 to Egerton, who had published her first book. And then it's published finally as Pride and Prejudice in 1813, January 28th, as a matter of fact. So, and meanwhile, she's working on Mansfield Park. And from this time forward, she's really productive. She's writing all the time. So that's pretty much the kind of publishing background for this. Her second novel, but maybe the earliest one that she worked on. So I thought that you can't really talk about Pride and Prejudice without talking about the opening. So, I mean, this is it's probably the most famous first sentence of a novel, or one of the three. I even have a beach towel that has the first two paragraphs printed on it. And I think a glass too with that. So it's something that we see a lot and hear a lot, but I think it's probably a good place to start the conversation. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. So I guess what I wanted to ask is, what kind of a way is this to start a novel? What kind of a world does this novel plunge us into through those opening sentences? Yeah, Jacob.
I heard someone say earlier that, Austen to some degree sounds like she's cut off from history. One thing that's funny about this opening line is that it seems to evoke, while kind of doing a send up of, the kind of style of Enlightenment discourse, right? This is the way men and philosophers talked back then. I mean, the founding of the United States, many of those guys sounded just like this.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of empirical, pseudo-objective style, and it does sound like that. But as we know, that this is a world full of emotion and subjective actions. So I just sense her really playing up that haughty masculine style of the time, the kind of I guess Enlightenment / neoclassicism or whatever they called it. So I hear that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, especially what you were saying about the founding of our country, when in the course of human events, that's kind of a truth, a universal truth that they're invoking right there. Yeah, that's great. Monica?
Hearing you read it out loud now and thinking about how openings are supposed to set up the rest of the novel, I'm really struck by the phrase rightful property. I mean, it's really interesting that in this very first thing, we have people being considered as not just property, but rightful property. And so I'm really thinking about what a great phrase that is in this very beginning.
Well, and it's also so funny because it's the woman who gets married who's actually going to be the property. But before the marriage, in this way of thinking, this kind of inverted way, it's the man who's the rightful property. So, I mean, there's a lot going on with that. Yeah.
Sarah?
I also think that the narrator builds the community there and the reader gets to be involved. So we're told the rules of the game. It's universally acknowledged, it's well fixed. So even if I am not of this time and place, I immediately understand the community and the sense that there is a community and the narrator is speaking for that community. So I'm immediately in a group of people.
Yeah, that is so interesting because I think this is I was noticing when I was rereading it, and I've noticed it before, but the community is really a character in this book. There's so much about what they're thinking and how they're, how they're viewing Darcy and how they're viewing Bingley, and and it's something that travels all the way through. It's yet another one of her dramatis personae, really.
I have the sense too that this is Jane Austen saying it with a great deal of irony. So it's the community perspective, but we also have the author's perspective behind that kind of irony there as well, right? So it's a double, the speaking is double at that moment. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and it kind of picks up what Jacob is getting at, that sense of her playing with this other language, this male Enlightenment language, and balancing that off against, these. Well, on the one hand, we have these generalizations, and on the other, we have these individual things: single man, good fortune, wife. And it really is, I think, very funny.
Yeah. We have Laura and then Marcia.
Well, I think it's especially funny, the beginning and the seriousness of it, followed by the first character we meet, which is Mrs. Bennet, who is clearly, I mean, for me at least, the most comic character in the book, the most clearly comic character in the book. And I loved how Eudora Welty talked about the noise, which, like Jacob said, I had never really thought of before either. But for me, she's also the noisiest character in the book. Every scene she's in, she makes a lot of noise. And for me, it's always funny. I mean, sad sometimes, but usually funny. But it's always, I think, bringing attention to the fact of how other people see this community that we're just talking about, how other people see the Bennets in general. Because she certainly attracts a lot of attention.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I want to come back to Mrs. Bennet in a minute. Marcia, you have something to add?
Sorry. So I had never thought of this before, but this is the first sentence is actually an example of free and direct discourse. You say to yourself, who is saying this? And it's the community, the fictional community that she has created that is saying it. The beginning, well, I don't want to get too far afield, but the beginning of the wedding by, who wrote that? Yeah, it begins with a description of this neighborhood and the expectations of the neighborhood. It's that novel set on Martha's Vineyard in the area that's the Black community. And that does the same thing. It makes the community, it gives you a spokesman for the community, and it gives you this gives you a statement that is being made not by the author but by the community. And it's that authorial, it uses the style of the 18th century writers who, the Age of Reason, as Jacob pointed out, but it actually says something that can be attributed to the community.
Yeah, I mean, it asks to be deflated, really, too. And in fact, well, I mean, I guess in a way it's a question: is the novel going to deflate that truth, universally acknowledged or not? And maybe not. Joellen?
I was just going to draw attention to the fact that the opening statement is also a kind of strategy of introduction. It's almost like an abstract, the general abstract of the chapter, in which we then see dramatized. And a similar thing happens in chapter 2, where Austen makes repetitions help bring a reader into a novel that starts getting really populated and busy fast, where chapter 2 begins with this paragraph statement. We already know that Mr. Bennet has gone to visit Bingley, and then it's dramatized. He tells his family dramatically, and in the same way, we start getting a little bit about characters that keep building. So Austen uses repetitions brilliantly, especially here to get us into the novel, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Harriet?
Yeah, I'm thinking with one more word in there that I want to pull out, and it's daughters. I'm thinking about daughters of this community, and the extent to, I kind of think about this book as in some ways being about different ways to be a daughter of this community. And that we see a bunch of different models of how to deal with this in the different women that we meet in the novel. But daughters, and in the context of being a daughter of this community, this remark.
Yeah, that's great. And the sentence lands on daughters. The paragraph lands on daughters. That's the last word. And then poof, we move right into that conversation. So yeah, it's like a little thesis in a way, or something like that, a jumping off point anyway. She's very conscious of forming sentences, for sure.
Cheryl, did you change your mind?
I did, and then I decided to circle back to what I wanted to, because the opening is so incredibly brilliant. And if we look back at the essay, I just posted something in the chat quoting one of the paragraphs, but Welty says that Jane Austen's writing was intentional, and that because of the fairy gifts that she was given or rewarded, and I like the rewarded part from her dedication to her education, right, and being well read, she's able to create an opening that is at once ironic, but also using the economy of words. Someone else in the chat made a comment with that phrase, gets directly to the point, and it, by getting to the point, shouts how absurd it is that a woman's only options for physical survival are marriage. And I think Dr. Ford can verify the veracity of this, but at the time that this was written, Jane Austen had turned down a proposal to a Mr. Biggs. He had proposed marriage to her, she accepted it, and then the next morning she canceled the engagement because her happiness was ultimately worth more than her financial security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I forget when that happens, but it's certainly before this is published. You know, by the time this is published, she's, you know, long past that. But it's true. I mean, she made a decision, and she knew what the implications were when she turns that proposal down. And that's, I think that whole issue of turning down marriage proposals as a serious business is something that we have to keep attending to during the course of this novel. You know, it's not just a romantic decision. It's also a decision that's going to have implications for your ability to survive. So, I mean, and that's the kind of serious core of this. Well, if we move from the opening of this well-fixed truth into this conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, was anyone struck, or can you talk at all about the narrative strategy here to move from all this generalization into the middle of this very particular conversation? Because I'll just say, I've had students who found this to be one of the most difficult novels to begin. And I think it's partly because of the jumps. I mean, I've noticed when I went through and was just charting the novel out to figure out how to break up the reading, that the first 8 chapters or the first 5 anyway, are short. So like chapter 1 is 2.5 pages. So is chapter 2. Chapter 3 is 4.5. Chapter 4 is 3. chapter 5 is 2 2/3. I mean, we keep kind of picking up and then getting set down again, and picking up in a different place and getting set down again. So there's not a sort of long expository passage at the beginning of this novel as there would be in many other novels of the period.
I think we have Harriet and Marion and Joe Ellen here. So Harriet?
So I was thinking back to Radiance and to the moment when Welty talks about Austen being crude sometimes, and how when I'm reading the essay, I'm thinking, what is she thinking of? And now, of course, it's clear to me she's thinking of this passage. She's thinking of the crudity of this discussion between Mrs. Bennet and her husband about how they're going to snare Mr. Bingley, I think that Mr. Bennet is a really interesting character who is both maybe a guide for the reader in terms of to find the comedy of the situation, but he's also a father who thinks of his daughters as silly and foolish, we don't know. We worry a little bit about his sensitivity to the situation that his daughters are in, and whether he's the right father for the situation. In this situation, he does go and meet Mr. Bingley and makes his wife, tortures his wife a little bit with his delay. But the question of the doubleness of how we respond to Mr. Bennet's comedy is already there in this first chapter.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, it occurred to me that the novel really aligns us with Mr. Bennet at the beginning, as it aligns us with Elizabeth and to some degree with Darcy. And, then it challenges that too,
Right.
There's also certain of their perspectives. And we're with them to start with. Marion? Oh, you're muted.
We already mentioned that Mrs. Bennet's funny, but she's not funny without Mr. Bennet. That's one thing I want to say. I mean, he makes it so funny. And also, Eudora pointed out that the novel takes in so many perspectives. And right away, we see two different perspectives on the issue of the daughters and marriage and so on. So it's clearly within the dialogue right away what kind of perspectives we're going to have, and we'll have a lot more.
Yeah, that's great. Joellen?
I just want to comment a little bit more fully on what I mentioned earlier regarding repetitions. And I think that for students who aren't used to reading things in small bits and holding it in mind, this can be difficult. But in that the first paragraph, there are 3 daughters named, and we get single attributes for each of them. But this elegantly builds on each little block that's placed in each chapter. In the second chapter, all 5 are named, but we still are getting to know the parents more. So we get to know the parents predominantly in these first 3 chapters. Even after the ball, when we meet more fully Bingley, Darcy, and even Elizabeth, we get more of a family dynamic there, but it ends up being mostly the parents arguing about, don't tell me any more about lace and that kind of thing. In chapter 4, we have 2 set pieces. We have the conversation between Jane and Lizzie, whom we've been getting to know a little bit. We also learn much more about the Bingley-Darcy relationship. So those 2 pairings are made clear. We finally meet the Lucases. We get background about how Mr. Lucas became Sir, the Lucas and the Bennet women. So we're learning bits and more. They're just they're add-ons in each chapter until we finally even get a word from Mary. They're all talking about Darcy as they're telling us about themselves. And she has this disquisition about pride. And the same thing keeps happening as we go on, I think, where we get to know, like we don't get Mr. Bennett's background, that kind of exposition until chapter 7. We get anyway, so we get to know Bingley, all of those men and their backgrounds scattered, but at the same time, we keep building these characters and their relationships. Anyway, I just think it's fabulously done.
Yeah, I do too. And I mean, I was noticing, especially with the Bennett daughters or sisters, the way that just what you were talking about, the way that we get through, 3 mentioned, we get 2 mentioned. There's one point in chapter 3 toward the end where we have, okay, Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter, much admired. Jane was gratified. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood. Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough to never be without partners. So here she's giving us a summary and a kind of tag for each of these characters in the birth order without telling us what she's doing, and after she's introduced us to all of them. Somewhere Jane Austen has a letter where she's writing to a niece who's trying to write novels, and she talks to her about how, well, there's a little bit too much of what's on the right hand, what's on the left hand here, as if what she's trying to show her niece is, let's get away from this kind of long passages of exposition or long passages of description, and just introduce the information as it's needed so that the reader builds a more complicated and I guess in some ways a more realistic picture of what's out there. Beverly.
I was thinking about the first 2 paragraphs, and they're almost like either the hook and the thesis statement in an essay or an abstract in a longer paper. And then when we move into that 3rd paragraph with the narrative, that's where we're going to prove what we've laid out in the first 2 paragraphs. Mm-hmm. We are going to be shown how these 2 paragraphs, the first sentence and then the second one, are actually true. And it's very smooth. I mean, they're not set apart, but the voices in the narrative structure is very different. Mm-hmm. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, I could almost see that on an abstract page. This is what I'm going to do. And then we move into the actual narrative, mm-hmm. Which of course, she proves her point.
Yeah, and continues to as we go through, where we hear about Mrs. Long and her daughters. We hear about Mrs. Lucas or Lady Lucas and her daughters. So we know all of Bingley's dancing partners, at least for the first 6 dances of the evening. So I mean, we get this kind of sense of a whole community that she's built really efficiently for us there. Well, excuse me.
We have Cheryl with the question, I think.
I think it's more a comment regarding the reason why so much explanation of each character was, we had to get their resumes, right? Mrs. Bennet was doing the right thing. She had 5 daughters that she knew had to survive in the world. So she needed the resume, the stat card, the baseball stats on the back of the baseball card to know which man she could pair off to each for each of her daughters. Like, her intentions are absolutely sincere. She's just very comic about it. And what about this? If Mrs. Bennet wasn't such a humorous character, would Jane Austen's point of the necessity of marrying off these daughters have been received by the audience? It would have been too blatant to look at it that way. But by having Mrs. Bennet as a humorous figure, it's palatable to the audience.
Yeah, that's really an interesting point. So we can laugh. But I think we also laugh and maybe don't take it seriously, as then we realize, or we're going to realize that we need to, you know, later on, with the whole Charlotte Lucas plot that's coming. Well, I guess, and I like, Cheryl, your idea of the stats or the baseball card for these different characters. And I was thinking about how Austen gets us interested in these characters and what features she starts to, or she needs to identify as significant. And we could talk about that in terms of the men, or we could talk about it in terms of the women, how they're kind of set up as foils for each other.
It's amazing how often money is mentioned.
Yes, well, property right from the beginning, right? But yeah, we know everybody's income.
Talk about the stat sheet. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like the number one piece of this. Yeah, Pearl.
I'm wondering if any of our readers are reading this for the first time, and if what those reactions are, if this is the first encounter, or if you've only seen the films and not read it. Does anybody want to think about that?
That's a great question. Is there anybody for whom this is a first reading?
Hi, this is Martha. This is my first reading.
Ah, great.
And I'm struck because I've seen the film, of course, a long time ago. I'm struck by sort of what Suzanne said, and I wish I had the discipline of Eudora Welty, but I don't. How much, you know, the richness of the language, and what really struck me is how, and all good literature, I think, does this for me. It just comes off the page and envelops you. And that's what I was struck with, this witty dialogue and the humor. And as much as I loved the film, you don't get the same sense. So I'm really appreciating the words.
Wonderful.
I want to apologize if I get up and run away. My dogs are running wild in the house, so I'm gonna have to take care of that. But I don't want to miss this. I'm still listening.
Okay. Harriet?
Yeah, I'm thinking about our introduction to the daughters and their stats. You know, Jane has beauty and an easiness, a non-judgmentalness. Elizabeth has intelligence and critical judgment, which can be harsh. Mary is sound. You know, it's interesting to me that that we have. It's clear that while we admire we're meant to admire the independence of Elizabeth, say, when she goes off to take care of her sister, walking in the mud and not caring about how she arrives. But when we get Mary, we get a woman who's got too many words, and they're too, maybe pedantic is not acceptable. And so it's I'm just thinking about the way in which we meet these women quickly in these chapters, and we're making judgments about them and in comparison with one another, and the way in which they are presented in the society, the way in which they handle this society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the two young ones, of course, are just interested in the soldiers. And then we get the mean girls, as somebody said earlier, the Bingleys, as well as Charlotte Lucas, you know, so we've got a number of different kind of potential models for young ladyhood here. Yeah, John.
I'm this is my first time to read Jane Austen. I'm responding to Pearl's question. I told some people who I knew, I've got some good friends who are big Jane Austen fans. And I told them about this, and I encourage them to get online and to listen to the discussion. When I told them, it was at lunch about a month ago, and they started quoting lines from Pride and Prejudice. They started condescending, patronizing. You know, one of the people there, he told me how his wife is always quoting Jane Austen to him, and that it was just it was a real eye opener, you know. And in terms of, you know, a response to the Radiance essay, yes, you know, she's remarkably alive and doing well. You know, all her works are, you know, and it's you know, that seeing the films, I have a real prejudice about, I think the men in all the films that I've seen, to me, they, except occasionally, you know, someone like Mr. Darcy, most of the men come across as dolts to me, and very foolish, very self-centered, not, and that does not appeal to me. You know, I like the women, and I was raised by women. I was by two different women in my life, and I came from a matriarchal clan. I'll just put it that way. But the men in these, you know, to me, there's just such a difference between English society and American society. And this is not a book about something that's going on in America. It's definitely about a certain time and a certain place in the world, you know, and very different than our country.
Yeah. I think that the men in Pride and Prejudice, though, a lot of them are not dolts. Mr. Bennet is not a dolt. Mr. Darcy is not a dolt. Mr. Bingley is, well, something. He's a good-natured young man. And what's the uncle's name?
Mr. Gardner.
Mr. Gardner, yeah, wonderful character. So,
yeah, I wouldn't call Mr. Bingley a dolt either. I mean, he is easily convinced of things by Darcy, but I mean, in the movie versions, he's more often played as dolt, especially I think in the Keira Knightley one.
Yeah, and I was referring to the that's my impression from the cinematic, you know, presentations of the men, you know.
Well, I've got to say we're at 1:02, so it's time to close. And unfortunately, we have some comments that are not commented, but if you have raised your hand, I hope you can preserve your comments, hold that thought, bring them up next week. Thank you so much all for participating. I want to give Suzanne and Susan any last closing words.
I'll defer to Susan.
Oh, gosh. Well, I guess I would close with what Eudora said that Suzanne already quoted. The reader is the only traveler. And so we can kind of travel, continue traveling through this novel and talk about the rest of this section and the next section next week.
We'll be discussing chapters 9 through 17. We'll see you then. Thank you all so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.